yeah, that one's really helpful for regenerating. Okay, we are here tonight to talk about food. And I've talked about herbs being foods, and we've talked about diet at other times, but tonight we're talking just about food because it is a key issue for most of us. We all love to eat. Most people say that that's why they can't lose weight when they can't lose weight. It's just because they love to eat too much. And that's probably only a little part of the truth. It's probably that they're not digesting the food, and it's the types of foods that they're eating and so forth. But tonight we're just going to talk about food. And I kind of played with the idea of doing this like a field trip and taking everybody shopping. But I didn't think the logistics would work on that, so we're just going to imagine it, and we'll talk through it and walk through it, and I'll tell you a little bit about what I buy and how I do it and so forth. But the first thing I want to do before we talk about what everybody should be eating and why they should be eating it is to talk a little bit about how to eat. Most people don't know how to eat. The people in Europe have laughed at us for years. Because, am I on? Okay. They say, you know, in Europe, dining is an art. And you have sidewalk cafes where the whole intent of it is to sit down and watch the world go by as you eat. Americans invented the drive-through. You know, we don't even stop long enough to sit to eat. We do it in the car, we do it on the run, we don't take the time to eat. And that has had, I think, one of the major impacts on the health and the physique of the American people. I was reading an interview a couple of days ago in a magazine with a British movie star, a girl who played in the Thomas Jefferson film. And she had come to America for the first time to promote the film, and they asked, you know, if she'd had any culture shock and what was her experience here. And the first thing she said was, I couldn't believe how many fat people there were. And you need to know that this is an American phenomenon. I grew up outside of the country, and it's really unusual to see large numbers of people as overweight as we have in this country. And I've joked, not even really funnily, about the fact that only in America can we afford to eat the way that we eat. In most countries, everything that people eat has to be valuable to them. In our country, we can afford to eat things. I remember several years ago in a Women's Day magazine, there was an article about some experimental pasta that was being made from some kind of a synthetic fiber, where you'd have the sensation of being able to chew it and swallow it and all the rest of it, but it would not break down. It would go right on through you with no calories. You know, only Americans could think like that. But that art of eating is really, really critical. And it's not just because when you are relaxed you digest more, although that's true. There were studies done that said that when you actually like deep breathe before you eat, you increase the digestion. I don't remember the percentages. But if you offer a prayer before you eat, you increase the digestion further. And if you offered a prayer and held hands while you ate or before you ate, you increase the digestion even more. I mean, it went from like 40 to 70%. It was a very, very big increase just by taking those few moments. That may be the literal blessing on the food that we ask and receive. It may be that we take that time to relax, to sit there for that moment before we start throwing the food down. I have 3 kids, and I've got Little League, and I've got ballet, and I've got all this other stuff to deal with too, and it is hard, but it does make a difference when you can gather your family around you and eat together at a table a solid meal. The other big advantage to sitting down and slowing down is that you're going to actually chew the food. Now that's kind of a novel thought for a lot of people. Most of your grandmothers used to tell you that, right? You should chew your food 10 times or chew it 20 times or whatever. And that's not just to get it small enough to go down without having to force it down with something to drink. But that's because the digestive enzymes that break down carbohydrates begin in your mouth, in the saliva. One of the experiments that we do with little kids is to put a saltine in their mouth and just put a bite of saltine in their mouth and sit there and nothing happens with their mouth. I mean, they're not chewing. They don't do anything to it. But what's going to happen in a matter of minutes? The saltine is mush. And then there's nothing left at all. And it begins to taste sweeter and sweeter. A saltine is not sweet, and yet it begins to taste that way as the carbohydrates begin to break down into the sugars and things that we're going to be more able to use. And so chewing that food is critical. That's the reason why I've never started my infants, my babies, on cereals. I have always started them on vegetables, steamed or lightly cooked vegetables, or raw fruits like bananas. Even when I made my baby's applesauce, I didn't cook the apples necessarily. Sometimes I would just totally puree them with a little bit of mother's milk or juice or yogurt or something in a food processor and make it very, very fine, but raw still for them. Aaron, my 8-month-old, was 8 months old when he decided that he had to forget nursing altogether, and he was only about 6 or 7 months old when he started to eat. Now, normally I nurse my babies until they started getting teeth. Well, Aaron, you would have to know, but Aaron is just a go-getter, and I was sitting with him at the table nursing him at about 6 months, and he reached over and grabbed a piece of cantaloupe, and whole thing right in his mouth and chomped it. It was very, very ripe and soft. Went right on down. He had no problem at all. I was sure. My mom was there. We all thought, this kid's going to be sick all night. He's going to have diarrhea. He's going to have a stomachache. Nothing. It broke right on down in there. So I wanted my babies to be able to break the foods down, and most babies don't chew. So what do? You stuff that cereal in their mouth, and it's straight on down the throat. In fact, there are bottles now that people have to basically push the cereal down the back of the baby's throat without them having any chance at all for saliva to contact that food, and it will not break down. In a lot of babies, it's going to give them colic, it's going to give them gas. In a lot of babies, it's not, but it's simply going to go on right through them so quickly that they're not gaining any nutrition from it. So those starches must be chewed. The next thing that most people need to think about in terms of eating is that most people, because they aren't chewing it, do grab that glass of something to chase everything right on down. And typically, it's a glass of something iced and cold and refreshing, okay? Now, if you're chewing your food for those 20 times or whatever, just like that saltine dissolves in a little child's mouth, you're going to find that whatever you eat is going to be very liquidy, and you're not going to feel the need to keep rinsing your food down. At my house, consistently, we have leftover glasses of juice. And I really try not to waste things, but I also, you sit out a nice glass on the table, and you hate to put out a half full glass on the table. It just doesn't look right. And so we just end up with all these half glasses of juice, and I put them in the fridge and say, okay, kids, this is your lunch, But it's important that you give that food that time to break down. Someone once said that you should drink your food and eat your drinks. So when you're drinking like a fruit juice, again, the saliva needs to contact it. And so you need to actually let it pass through your mouth and swallow it, a swallow at a time. And most people are just chugging it straight on down the gullet fast as possible. Now, if that's something that you're drinking is not fairly acidic, then you're going to be changing the acid balance in the stomach. And a lot of the proteins are not going to be able to be digested properly. So when people are going to drink with a meal, and again, you're not going to need to drink a huge amount if you are chewing properly and eating raw foods, but you'll find that you're going to just be taking those sips, and I encourage people to drink something that's got some acid to it. That could be a diluted fruit juice. It could be lemon juice in water. That's the custom in most of Europe. Something that's going to change the pH a little bit, because normally the stomach is a very, very highly acid environment. The pH is I think, around a 1.5, okay? Now, water has a neutral pH. It's considered dead neutral. That's a pH of about 7. And so what do? When you take in the 7 and the 1.5 acid, what are you going to accomplish? You're going to raise the pH of the stomach, and it will no longer be capable of breaking down the proteins in the body as adequately as without all of that dilution. And so, especially if you're drinking chlorinated water, which is extremely alkaline, you find that you're throwing your stomach acid level just way, way off. And it's going to be very, very hard to break that down. The third thing to be conscious of with these drinks is the iced drinks, as I said. Now, when somebody comes up behind you and sticks a handful of ice in the small of your back, what's your reaction? Everything just locks up tight because those muscles are spasming from the cold. Well, your stomach is muscular. So when you take that iced stuff and you chug it on down there, your stomach does exactly the same thing when it gets all that stuff in there. And so if it's doing that with a stomach full, especially of protein, because people always do this with the burgers, right? Then you've got that stomach unable to process it because of the cramping, and it will typically just spasm and force open the valve, and everything goes right on into the small intestine. Now, your small intestine doesn't break down proteins, okay? That's where the enzymes from the pancreas are going to move in and break down your starches and your fats and your sugars and those kinds of things. But it's only going to be able to break the proteins down the rest of the way if the hydrochloric acid has already had a chance to do its job. And for most people, that's not going to have happened. They're going to be low in hydrochloric acid because they've been drinking chlorinated water. They're going to be low because they're over the age of 30, and at about 20 or 25, you start to reduce your acid just because you don't need to make as many new bone cells and so forth. You're not growing anymore. So you keep it usually through the 20s and into the 30s, especially for women you need that because you're procreating. But after 30 or 35, the stomach acid level just drops way, way off because they don't feel like you would be needing as much protein anymore. So you've got this undigested stuff going into the small intestine, which is where it begins to decay. And decaying food is what causes gas and what causes irritable bowels and colitis and all that kind of stuff going on in here because you're asking an organ to do something it was never designed to do. So going back to sitting down to eat, and to eating slow, and to eating without a lot of drinking, and to eating without drinking anything iced, is going to make a big difference. The last thing that's important for most people, and this isn't a class about the digestive system, so we don't want to do too much of this, but is to make sure your stomach is in position. For lots and lots of Americans who are tense and tend to internalize their emotions, and who tend to be very deficient in trace minerals because they haven't digested food for so long and have eaten wrong, their stomach tends to ride up into the diaphragm. A physician will call that a hiatal hernia. And so the stomach acid starts flipping up into the diaphragm or the esophagus, and that burns. And so you take lots of antacids so you don't have any acid in the stomach, and guess what? We just talked about what that does. But most people just need to get their stomach back down in position, and you can massage it down. You can take the breath, and you can blow out hard. And if you'll do that, you'll feel those muscles compressing and pushing the stomach back down into position. And I know when you're very, very tense, from my own experience, I tend to have a magnesium deficiency anyway. What tends to happen is that everything locks up and literally your food sticks right here. You know, when people say I'm all choked up, that's what happens. And until you've taken enough deep breaths and gotten things relaxed there, the food literally will not be able to move through that muscle. All right? So those are the important things. Now, a couple of other peripheral things that you wouldn't normally think about in terms of how you should be eating is what to be eating from. Most people, I hope, know that you don't want to be cooking in aluminum. Any of your aluminum pots, aluminum storage containers, aluminum foil in baking, anything like that, aluminum is very unstable. And especially with anything acid contacting it, it tends to migrate. I remember in college one time I made a casserole that had some sour cream in it, and I didn't have any plastic wrap or a lid, and I threw tin foil over it. Have you ever done that? Tin foil, when it contacts sour cream, which is acidic, it dissolves it. It dissolved my tin foil in a couple of days. And what wasn't dissolved was very black, okay? So it's just unstable, and that's the reason why we want to avoid the aluminum as much as possible. In the cookware is one of the most dangerous conditions because you're heating it. And as you know, when you heat something, the molecules move faster. And so they tend to migrate out faster, especially if you're cooking something acid. So you've got tomato soup in an aluminum pan, and you're in a very precarious position. In Europe, where they've been more conscious of this kind of thing for years, they no longer simply call Alzheimer's disease a syndrome, but they, in many cases, are actually considering it a case of advanced aluminum poisoning. Because over the course of years, people have eaten from aluminum pans, they've used aluminum underarm deodorants and antiperspirants, they've used aluminum in cosmetics. Many of your blue shades are aluminum powders. And today in America, we have aluminum cans. And we have aluminum cans with NutraSweet in them. And NutraSweet, this is not the what to eat section yet, but we're going to cover it here because it makes sense. NutraSweet is one of the few substances that can pass through the blood-brain barrier. Okay? Now, in the brain, it's a chemical barrier that medicine does not understand yet, but it somehow seems to screen out certain substances from being able to be carried into the brain. And that's one of the reasons that they have such a hard time treating brain tumors with chemotherapy. The drugs can't get in there because the brain will not permit it. NutraSweet is one of the few substances that can pass through the blood-brain barrier, and the nature of the molecule is such that it can also act as a carrying agent. So whatever it bonds with, it will carry through the blood-brain barrier and into the brain. And so when you're drinking your NutraSweet from an aluminum can, what are you doing? It's a dangerous thought, isn't it? So we want to be very, very conscious of that. I don't think most of us should be drinking soft drinks anyway. The phosphoric acid in them neutralizes calcium, just dissolves it right out of the body. So every time that you drink a soft drink, you're wiping out the calcium. This is where labeling becomes really interesting, right? Because one of the soft drink companies right now is planning to market a soft drink with added calcium. And they can say that because with added, or whatever the ingredients are the ingredients before the heat sealing and all the rest, okay? Now, they did put calcium in there. The fact that it is disintegrated is beside the point. They did add calcium, therefore they can say, with added calcium, and believe that they're doing you a favor. But that's why Don Aslett suggests that you use a cola to clean your toilets with, because the phosphoric acid will dissolve lime rings in the toilet bowl, more, he says, faster than anything else. So, just kind of contemplate that the next time you feel like you can't do without one. If you especially are a person who tends to have skeletal problems, stiffness and achiness and creakiness and bones that break and arthritis, those kinds of things, you may want to consider your calcium level before you consider your taste buds. So those are just details, okay? Some other peripheral kinds of things that affect how you eat or what you eat are your dishware. Now, most of us, we're not eating off of aluminum dishes, and most of us are conscious of, not using lead dishes or anything like that. But one of the things that all of us do is wash our dishes. And what most of us are washing them with are commercial dish liquids or dish soaps that go into your automatic dishwasher, right? Well, all of those have chlorine added to them. The dishwashing powders in higher percentages than the dishwashing liquids, okay? Now, if you've got a dishwashing powder and it goes onto your plates, and it does, remember, at a very high temperature, then it's going to put a seal on your dishes, isn't it? And that's why you get the spots. It is not just calcium in the water, I promise you, because when I use a non-commercial, I use right now the Natural World dishwashing powder, when I use that, I get no spots on my glasses. I get no spots on my dishes of any kind. I have the same water I have always had. So this is not lime deposits or calcium deposits on my glasses. This was detergent deposits on my glasses. That whole film that you get on the glasses, I don't have anymore because of changing detergents. It's the only thing I did, and I didn't do it for that reason. I was really surprised. But when you have that change take place, you suddenly realize that you've got a residue on all of your dishes that's been there for years. Now, chlorine is very volatile in heat, okay? And if you open your dishwasher after it's hot and done, can't you smell the chlorine? Maybe you've never connected it to being that smell, but that's what you're smelling. So think about it. You've got a plate now that has that residue on it, and it's going to cool down, but you're going to put hot food on the plate, and what's that going to do to the rest of the chlorine residue? It's going to release it right into your food. And so you're changing the acid levels of that food before you ever eat it. You've already made it more alkaline and changed it and made it something that the body's going to have a harder time breaking down because it's going to start affecting the pH too. So something like that is not something you'd normally associate with your eating, but that's what you're doing when you're cleaning with those commercial products. You're drinking or eating residues of those products every time you eat a meal. Yes? Well, good. Check it and see with most of them, because most of the products, all of your commercial supermarket type stuff does have it, okay? So we want to make sure that what we're using is not going to complicate what we're trying to do with the rest of our bodies. And there are so many areas like that. When we get to the one on environmental things, that, even after years and years of working this way and studying this way and living like this, I'm still coming up with stuff and saying, oh my gosh, I never thought about that before. So it is a learning technique and a learning process that all of us are going through and will continue to go through, because we're constantly going to be coming up against things we haven't even considered before or had to encounter before. And that brings us to what to eat, okay? And I'm really liberal that way. It's really fun. When people come to my office, they come in expecting me to give them a long list of proscriptions. Don't eat this or that or the other thing. And most people are pretty certain about that. When I travel and I'm teaching workshops in other areas, it's a riot, because when I'm in someone's home, they are a nervous wreck. They all immediately assume I've got to be a vegetarian, and I have to eat no fat, and I have to eat none of this and none of that, and they really make themselves very, very upset. And frankly, I'm really very easy to please. There are definite preferences, but I decided years ago that the best compromise for me and for my household was that in my home, we're going to eat very specifically for our health. When we're out and can't control that, by that time we should have bodies that are capable of dealing with one of these things from time to time without having a major crisis. Now, that would not be true if I was fighting a serious illness or was in some kind of another state. So I'm not blanketly saying, yeah, eat great at home and do whatever you feel like everywhere else. But for our family, under most circumstances, that works. And so I have not had refined sugar in my home for years and years. I have no need for it. The taste buds, frankly, are not even there anymore for that kind of food. And quite honestly, we don't use a lot of honey either. I don't care for the taste of honey, and with baking and so forth, typically you very much taste the honey. I do occasionally bake with turbinado sugar, dehydrated cane juice, something that is still refined to some extent, but not to the bleach stage. When they refine sugar, when they're processing sugar, they take sugar cane, pure cane, and they squeeze the juice out, okay, press the juice out. They dehydrate that, or boil it, actually, boil that juice out, and make molasses to some extent. Some of the stuff comes out. Some of the other residue is clarified, and that syrup then is dehydrated or dried, and it's bleached, actually bleached, okay, and that's where you get your final white sugar. The dehydrated cane juice, instead of having the molasses separated out, which is where all the minerals have gone, and then having that leftover stuff that they dry up and you eat after they bleach it, the dehydrated cane juice has all of those minerals intact. And so while it is extremely sweet to the taste, it doesn't have as many of the damaging effects because it's not going to be robbing the body of all the minerals that it needs to be complete. It's got those minerals still intact in it. I was talking to someone who had been raised in the Caribbean, and they said that they were talking to people, and the historians had wondered what had kept the people going in the sugarcane fields. You know, how could these people work 11 and 12 hours a day nonstop and not die at 16, you know? And their reasoning was that they were eating the cane all the time. They had it constantly going into their taste buds, into their mouth. When I was in Thailand, I was a cheerleader, and that's what we would do during the games, is constantly be sucking on a piece of the sugar cane. And it was not just the sugar that was there, but the minerals and the fluid as well. With just the sugar, we would have been great for the first half and collapsed for the rest of the game. But with the sugar cane, it was much less dramatic in effect. We use maple syrup, which is a refined product to some extent because it's been boiled and so forth. But we use all of our sweeteners in moderation. And for most of us, we really want to avoid the white sugar. In the body, it breaks down in very much the same way that alcohol breaks down. And part of the problem that we have with sugar is that it tastes so sweet that it causes the body, chemically it is so sweet, it causes the body to overproduce insulin. So you produce a lot of extra insulin that's released into the bloodstream. And because of sugar breaking to acetaldehyde, it can go through the cell membranes to some extent, right into the bloodstream. And it can also be broken down in the bloodstream without insulin to some extent, again, because of the way it breaks down on its own. And so what happens is you get the pancreas and you make all this insulin, and it gets where it's supposed to be, and your body says, just fooling. We don't really need all this extra stuff. And so your adrenal glands have to kick back in and produce norepinephrine, which is another hormone to help break down the extra insulin, so your adrenals just go into this state of overdrive. And that's why people get adrenal exhaustion, and that's why they become much more stressed and much more agitated when they're consuming large amounts of sugar. It's a physiological response. It's not just, oh, my kid ate a candy bar and he bounces off the walls. There's an actual reason there. And that's why it tends to get worse and worse, and why people crave more and more and more sugar, because the body gets more and more stressed and fatigued, and the adrenals need more and more support, and so you calculate that as, aha, I need some sugar, and you get into a cycle that can be very, very damaging to the body. So I don't prohibit my kids from eating malted milk Easter eggs when they go to an Easter egg hunt at somebody's house and they're given them. But they know that it's something they don't do often. They know that it's something they never do when they're sick, because sugar breeds bacteria. It's a great breeding ground. What do you want to feed bacteria if you're culturing it in a petri dish? Usually it's a solution of sugar and protein. Because it's not broken down in the same way. Okay? So we want to keep the body at an even keel. Okay? We want to give it foods that are going to have a very sustained energy level. Now, if you have to choose between a baked potato and a baked apple to keep your hands warm inside of a muff, which are you going to choose? The potato, because it's going to stay hot much, much longer. The carbohydrates are what give the body that very sustained energy level. That's why athletes carbo load and do spaghetti dinners before they do a big race the next day. Those carbohydrates are the foods that give us very sustained, very clean energy. And that's what I think most of us should be basing our diets on. The carbohydrates that we're most going to be able to access are grains, whole grains, not refined, bleached, and processed foods. I did a class one time, and we filled a grocery bag full of stuff And we went in, and I presented it to somebody, and I said, oh, wait a minute. And I took out most of the things in the bag, and I handed it back to them, and I said, there, isn't that better? And they didn't get the message at all. I mean, they had no idea what I was talking about. But we went on to explain that enriched flour has been refined to the extent that 26 elements have been removed from it, 26 critical trace minerals. But they put 5 or 6 of them back in there, and then they call it enriched flour. And we think that it's wonderful that they're giving us all this extra stuff. Well, what you've lost is not just the fiber, but you've lost all of your B vitamins, which are found in the bran. And aren't we all a very stressed society? And aren't B vitamins what help the body's nervous system to prevent, or to function as they should? And so when we're taking that bran out, it's not just hurting our intestinal system, but it's also very much affecting the nervous system that we all have. And so getting those whole grains back in there is going to be critical for that reason as well. They're going to give us the very sustained energy. They're going to give us a very complete protein. And one of the things, the fallacies that medical science has faced now is that they used to say you had to eat it all at the same meal. You had to have your rice and your beans together. And it's true that in most countries in the world, people do those kinds of things. You have your black beans and rice from one area of the Caribbean. You have your other types of corn and beans in Latin America. In India, they make a pilaf, and they'll use lentils and rice. Or throughout the Middle East, where they'll use couscous, grains, with lentils or split peas. And so you've got a grain and a legume combination in most places. You have grains like spelt, which have most of the amino acids and are basically a complete protein in and of themselves. Those are the grains that have usually been lost. You have grains like amaranth, which was one of the Central American grains that was banned by Cortez when he came to take over, because they considered it the food that made them the healthy, strong warriors that they were. So he burned all of the fields and refused to allow them to grow the product because he felt that would weaken them physically. And we've heard that an army marches on its stomach. Well, their army did, and they marched on grains. Throughout the native cultures, you have stories of people chewing on seeds of quinoa or seeds of millet and just keeping those, constantly chewing them, breaking them down, and allowing the body to absorb that extra food from them on a regular basis. When you sprout those grains, you then add a whole bunch of vitamin C, which just miraculously forms when you sprout a grain. It's not in there. Grains do not possess vitamin C until you sprout them. It increases the protein content. It increases the ability of the body to break the protein down. So in a number of different ways, grains are really an ideal food. And for most of us, I think they should be the basis of our diets. I'm not a vegetarian. And I'm not a vegetarian because of my own personal body type. And I think that's something that most of us don't take into consideration. People will read a book and they'll say, okay, everybody should eat fruit for breakfast, nothing else. Well, I'm a thyroid-dominant body type. That's why I'm shaped the way I am. That's why I talk as fast as I talk. That's why all of the things that happen in my body happen the way that they do. And the thyroid gland is very much stimulated by sugars and carbohydrates. And so if I did nothing but a muffin in the morning, which is my preference, I mean, if I was going to raid the fridge, that's what I would go for. Must be that thin. So the body type that you have is going to very much determine the kinds of foods that you crave, but also the kinds of foods that you should avoid. And most of us should avoid the foods we crave. Unless you really have an understanding of the cravings, then you can say, gee, I'm craving chocolate, I must need magnesium. And that's a legitimate thing. When you've got a chocolate craving, if you can take some magnesium or some herbs high in magnesium or something, usually the chocolate craving will disappear. The body has a way of telling us what we want, but we sort of misinterpret things. When we want sugar, typically we need protein. Why? Because the adrenals are suppressed, that's why we're craving the sugar, but what supports the adrenal glands the most is protein. And so as much as I would like to go grab a muffin for breakfast and nothing else, or a piece of fruit, if I do that, immediately what happens is my thyroid kicks into gear, which is my dominant overworked gland anyway, and my adrenals go, oh no, not again. Can't we just have a piece of an egg or something with protein in it, something with substance to get my adrenals built back up? And I don't want it first thing right off the bat, but if I wait and eat a late breakfast and a big breakfast, I have the most productive days. If I do nothing but fruit in the morning, I am so psyched, and I go, and I go, and I go, and by 2 o'clock, I am about to die because I've used up all my energy. By the contrary, someone who is a strict adrenal type who wants a meat and potatoes a breakfast, if you give it to them, they keep moving through their life at the same pace all day. If you can get them the carbohydrates and get them the fruits and so forth, they tend to stimulate some of the other parts of the body, and you tend to get a little more energy out of them. So those balances are different for everyone, and that's why I don't have one dogmatic diet that everybody shall do this and this and this. I think that we were counseled to eat the grains of the field and the herbs-bearing seed, and those are grasses, and that's grains, okay? But for what we fill in with that, I think we need to consider how and where we do it. Now, we hear that in most countries other people are vegetarians, and that's not entirely true. I've lived in a lot of countries, and there are a few very strictly vegetarian societies, but every society that I've experienced, short of something like the Eskimo, subsists on very little meat. They'll make a stew, and they'll eat the stew with bread, with couscous, with grains, over rice, something. But it's a little bit of meat and a lot of vegetables and a broth of some kind. They save all those nutrients because when you cook it and throw the water away, you've lost most of your minerals. They've saved all that in the sauce, and then they're serving that with the grain, with the bread, whatever, and you would sop up all the juice because the juice is the most nutritious part. And that's the way that most of the world will eat. We have the privilege of having our wild, wild west. And with our wild, wild west came lots of room for cattle. And that's why we became the kind of society that we are today, where we could just, call off and cut a slab and go for it. But that's not the norm, and that's not what our bodies do best with. We have long, small intestines. And long, small intestines in the animal kingdom usually are reserved for the vegetarians, the animals that live mostly on grains and so forth, not for the carnivores. They get very, very short ones. So I think that eating meat is fine, but there are some cautions and things you need to be aware of in meat. 80% of the antibiotics produced in this country are fed to animals. And so when you're eating dairy products, when you're eating meat that is commercially processed or grown, you are taking in an enormous amount of animal product or of antibiotics, of steroids, of other hormones. Many of you may remember years ago there was some chicken workers, the men that were beginning to develop breasts. And they found out it was from handling the chicken feed all day, which was laced with hormones to cause the chickens to produce more eggs and to grow plumper breasts. We want white meat on our animals. So those kinds of changes are not things that are naturally occurring in meat. In your game animals, you don't have that kind of contamination. There is organic meat available, but it's extremely expensive because those animals are able to eat nothing but grain, whole grains, corn-fed beef or whatever. And your commercial animal feeds are fortified with a lot of other waste products, with byproducts from plants that are fillers. And they lace that in there with some synthetic vitamins and add some other stuff to it. But the animals are not eating the way that they were eating. They're not grazing. So they're not getting the variety of nutrients that they would have otherwise. There are a lot of differences. The fat content is going to be different because the animals are primarily raised in a more confined area than ranging for months and months and months out of the year. So there are a lot of differences in the way that meat's processed today. Several years ago, my mother and I did a lot of catering, and we made a huge dish of crab dip for a medical center opening. And my mom tasted it and came over and said, "Kim, taste this." And I tasted it, and it tasted like bleach. Now, my mom was beside herself. I mean, this was an enormous amount of crab meat that we had used up, and she went back over her head. Well, I washed off the counters and bleached them down, because you have to do that. But that was before I ever started anything, and I know I took the rags out to the garage, and we couldn't figure out what the deal was. And so finally she called the crab place, the seafood place where we bought the crab, which is a processing place as well as a retail market. And she told the person that something had to have been in the crab meat, that the crab meat tasted funny. And they assured her that it was either in her imagination or something that she had done or one of the other ingredients or whatever. And we went back and we still had some of the mayonnaise left and some of the cream cheese and all this other stuff, and we tasted, everything else tasted fine. There was definitely a problem with crab. So we went through the manager and through the next manager and finally got to the owner. And he acknowledged that in our state and in most states, all fresh seafood has to have a chlorine dip before it can be sold. And that's to prevent bacterial growth and to kill off anything that might be there. And he's acknowledged that probably what had happened was that in the case of lump seafood, lump crab meat, that they typically will dip the container and drain it. And that one obviously had not been adequately drained. So, thinking, well, I'll just go to the seafood market and get fresh fish isn't going to solve the problem either. It's something that as a society we're going to have to deal with and face. And so while the seafood may be lower in fat or other things, you're still not getting a perfect food anywhere. The chickens probably have the highest level of hormones in them. But that's rapidly changing too. Personally, I think that's one of the reasons why we have the superbugs that we have, the things that are immune to so many medications, because we've had so much of that in our bodies, not just from what we've taken for every little infection or glitch that we've had in our lives, but for all of it that we've ingested in other forms, our dairy products and so forth. I also heard someone recently speak who had been a dairy farmer for many, many years, who said that an enormous number of cows have leukemia, and that's not considered a problem in milk production. As long as they continue to produce milk, that's considered acceptable. But it's something like 60% of the cows, according to his estimates, have leukemia. And that's something else just to be aware of. Obviously, this is not a healthy animal. Can a healthy woman produce healthy milk to support her baby? Probably not, because she can only make for her baby what she has to work with, like the rest of us. So that's why I encourage caution and awareness with that. I'm going to do fat in a minute. I want to go on a little bit more before we go to fat. So don't sit there and say, yes, but what about the fat and the eggs and the meat and all that? I think that the single most important thing that most people should do in their diet is to increase the amount of raw food that they take in. Now, if you take a cabbage leaf and you throw it out into your yard and you let it sit there for 3 or 4 days, after 3 or 4 days, you will basically have fertilizer. There will be maybe traces of that leaf still intact, but for the most part, it will have begun to age, or accelerated aging, and basically decayed and fallen back down in between the leaves, and it's part of your grass now. If you take a boiled cabbage leaf at the same time and throw that out into your yard, you will have a sticky, smelly, yucky, buggy mess, because that dead cabbage leaf is going to require a lot of outside help to break down, whereas that live cabbage leaf still has enzymes in it that are going to allow it to age and decay naturally. So when you take raw food into your body, you're taking something in that's going to, in the heat of the stomach, begin to age more rapidly and start to break itself down. And in the process will also alleviate the stress on your pancreas and help the body to use the enzymes that it has more readily. So you've got a bigger selection of enzymes to use. So you're going to digest things much, much faster. I've seen estimates as high as increasing the rate at which meat goes through the body by 40% by eating it with a salad or with something raw. We probably ought to eat it at the same time or after our other food instead of eating it first. Most of us, what do? People have asked me a lot of times about food combining, and personally I think there's some validity to it, but I think that it ends with our common sense. Most of us just don't want, sour cream and orange at the same time. It doesn't appeal to us. Ice cream and watermelon, or I don't know. It just doesn't sound right to eat certain foods together, and most of us are aware of that. And so we're automatically going to combine foods correctly. I think that for most of us, what we need to consider is more accurately layering our food. If you're going to be eating a lot of protein, when would be the best time to do that? It's going to be when you have the highest concentration of stomach acid, which is going to be at what point? At the beginning of a meal. Okay? At the beginning of your meal, you're going to have the most acids there, especially if you're cooking with aromatic herbs and you've got all those stimulated senses. And then begin to add those other foods. So it's almost, you could eat the salad for dessert, and that would work out really well. But we want to get the foods in there in a way that they're going to be broken down. And the layering it, to me, is more important than trying to worry about eating this at that hour and this at that hour. And I've seen some very complicated books on it. That these foods should only be eaten at 9 o'clock in the morning, and these foods you never eat after 2, but these foods you never eat before 4. And, for some people, I think, again, that's going to be an individual thing, that you're going to know how your body works. But the raw foods overall are going to be the single most important change that most of you can make, and that doesn't cause any major changes. People are always concerned about their kids not eating that kind of stuff. Well, I can tell you that most kids will eat anything they can dip. If they can dunk it, they will eat it. And so making stuff that they can dunk available and making a healthy dunking stuff for them is one way to just real quick get stuff right on down their throats. Okay? The rule that I try to follow at my house, and I am not perfect by any stretch, okay? We all have those days, you know. But what I try to reach for in my family is that I try to serve 3 raw foods at every meal. And so at breakfast this morning, we had a lot going on today. We had just whole wheat toast with butter and honey, but I cut up mangoes and kiwis and oranges. And my kids all have to eat a couple of slices of each to go along with the bread that they ate. And that doesn't mean a salad all the time. It means when I make a sandwich, we might have sprouts and onions and apples on it. It's going to have 2 or 3 things. And if you're making, tuna salad, the tuna salad could have all the raw stuff added in there. One of my kids' favorite lunches in the summertime especially is I'll take cream cheese and whatever I've got in the crisper drawer, and it all goes in the food processor. And so we have carrots and spinach and garlic, lots of garlic, that's real important, and lots of parsley and lots of lemon juice, and then whatever else is in the crisper drawer, and make like a dip. And my kids will eat that on crackers. They'll eat it with vegetables as a dip. I'll let them eat it with corn chips, not commercial hydrogenated fat kind of corn chips, but we'll eat, my favorite are something called pinto chips, which are made with pinto beans and corn, so you have a very complete protein right there. I was talking about that earlier, combining proteins. What I neglected to say and was trying to lead up to is that what they've discovered now is that the body does store the bits and pieces, the amino acids, and so forth. And so if you eat your beans at one meal and the rice at the next meal, the body will still be able to metabolize that and make a complete protein out of it. They used to think you had to do it all at once, but they now know that it stores in the body for about 48 hours. And so you can overlap your foods and not have to always have rice and beans together. So you can be a little bit more creative there. So raw foods, those are just other ways that I try to get them in there. Tacos, people who think their kids won't eat healthy, feed them tacos. My kids would do that 3 times a week. Tacos with I don't use meat in my tacos. Wherever I can avoid meat, I do. Okay, when I make spaghetti sauce, I don't usually put meat in it. When I make tacos, we don't usually put meat on them. But we do refried beans, and we do cheese, and then we do onions and sprouts and tomatoes and olives and lettuce and peppers and avocados. And you can see how the raw food just adds right on up and you didn't think about it. It may be just cut up fruit. Like I said, it might be a salad. Now, a lot of people, you just have to add that one extra thing. Everybody makes a carrot raisin salad, right? So I throw apples in mine. So there's that one extra food. And the 3 is just a number I came up with because I have to reach a little. It's really easy to do 2. Lettuce and tomato on a sandwich. That's easy. Lettuce and tomato and something else you have to think about. And so that's what's worked for me. The same thing with my coleslaw. I mean, my coleslaw always had cabbage and carrots in it. And so now sometimes I'll slice green peppers really thin and throw some of those in, or decorate it with green onions or something, but try to get that extra food in there, that extra raw food in there. In the wintertime, most people don't want cold food. You don't want a salad in the winter, which makes sense. Okay, the body's going to have to heat all that food up. And if you're already cold, it's not something that you want to do. But raw food means still having the enzymes alive to me. It doesn't mean fresh from the crisper drawer or fresh from the garden, which is the real way to eat it. But if I'm making split pea soup, I will cook my split peas and my lentils, and barley, I usually throw that in there, and potatoes. But then I'm going to take my carrots and celery and onions and anything like that that doesn't really have to be cooked to taste pleasant, and just shred it in the food processor or chop it very fine and stir it in after I've already turned the lentils off or the split peas off. And that's going to steam that food. It's still going to be vibrant. It's still going to be alive. The kids like it better as a rule because it's still got some crunch to it. So there's texture there. And the reason most kids don't like vegetables is because they're cooked mushy. And children as a rule don't like mushy stuff. It just tastes funny or feels funny. And to children especially, the texture of food is very, very important. And so just keeping it real crispy like that makes a difference. And you can do that with potato soup or even vegetable soup. Who says you have to cook your carrots in your vegetable soup? Just because your grandma did and your mom did and everybody before her did. Just, you can take that next step, which is just to throw it in there. Now, most people love Chinese food because it's so textury. The textures are so varied and so different. And when you see Chinese food, you know how that broccoli just glows, bright, bright green. They've cooked it until the enzymes are at their peak of activity, and then they stop. And that's why it has that beautiful green color. If you've ever steamed broccoli yourself and overdone it, if you watched broccoli die, you actually see the death of this plant when it goes from that vibrant, alive green to gray. And that's what you want to avoid. So when you've got that bright green in your carrot cabbage soup or whatever, you know that you've got something that's very vibrant and very alive and very viable. And so those are the ways that you can bring it in there. We'll make a grilled cheese sandwich in the wintertime, and then we'll stuff it full of apples and sprouts and onions after the fact. Okay? So it doesn't have to be something that's cold all the time in order to technically still be raw. We'll do that with oatmeal. If you can stir, and now think creatively here. How many people are buying packaged oatmeal with this flavor or that flavor or whatever other flavor, artificial flavors and stuff added, right? Well, you can take your own cinnamon and apples and nuts and raisins and make cinnamon apple oatmeal. It's a lot less expensive than the individual little teeny packs. It's much, much more nutritious, and you've got your raw foods there. You can do that with pineapple and oranges and coconut and stir that into oatmeal. So there's a lot of creativity that you can throw in here if you just stop and think. And as I said, for 3 raw foods a day, or 3 raw foods a meal, that was something that was real easy for me to remember and to try to reach for. The other thing that I do with raw foods at my house is that my snack rule at my house, and now remember, I don't keep junk food at my house, and so that means if I've got crackers or I've got chips or even cookies, they're healthy, good stuff. But the rule at my house is that my kids can help themselves to anything if it's the way that it grew. So they can get a radish, they can get a carrot, they can get a cucumber, they can get turnips, nuts, raisins, anything out of the refrigerator if it's the way God made it. If it's been done had anything done to it, they have to ask me first. And I have been called on that. Always it's Aaron. I was making dinner, literally putting dinner on the table one night, and Aaron came out with one of my organic juice carrots. These weapon-sized things. And he was chomping on the end of this carrot, and I said, Aaron, put that back. We are ready to eat right now. And he looked at me and he said, but Mommy, it growed this way. And, I had given my word. I'd made the rule, so I had to honor that. But, I don't think that anything I would have served him that night would have been any more nutritious or any more valuable to his body than the carrot. So we really didn't lose out anything on that way. But that's been real easy for my kids. That's a nice way to get them eating the right kinds of things. Now, I promised I'd talk a little bit about fat. And I probably should tell the story again. I've told it on the first tape, and I've told it in a lot of my classes. But why I feel totally comfortable telling you to ignore everything that prominent medical scientists are saying right now. When I was 11 years old, I was diagnosed with osteoporosis. And I was diagnosed by a number of doctors and eventually ended up at Johns Hopkins University Hospital being diagnosed. And they said, osteoporosis is a brittle bone disease. It's usually only old women that get it, and somehow you got it too. And what it means is I had broken 5 bones in 3 months, okay? Or 3 bones in 5 months. What it means is that you've got too much calcium in your bones, and it's making your bones really hard and brittle, and so you shouldn't have any more calcium. So for a couple of years, I was told to really limit my calcium intake. Now, that was 20 years ago, okay? What are medical scientists today saying? You have calcium locked in your bones because you're so deficient in calcium. So you need to add a lot of calcium to your diet. Which one was it? This is the top medical experts who really knew what they were doing. And I think they did know as much as they knew. And the problem with science is that we always think we've known it all now. Personally, I think that calcium is not the issue with osteoporosis. I think it's magnesium, which is what determines whether the calcium stays locked in the bone or stays in solution, the way that the body's going to be using it. So having had that experience, I really don't feel uncomfortable saying the things that I'm going to be saying about fat, okay? About 3 years ago, right before this low-fat craze swept the nation, it was, I think, in July, I was sitting here and I happened to glance over at the evening news. And I think it was CBS, and the guy, Dan Rather, was saying that they had just done this study, and they had found that until the age of about 8, that children needed 40% of their calories from digestible fat in order for the brain to develop properly. Now, 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, I guess now, on my son's Little League team, random draw from a hat, 8 out of the 11 boys on his team were on Ritalin. And Ritalin, obviously, is to control a condition where the brain is not functioning properly. And I have to wonder if there's not a relationship between these children that have been raised with hydrogenated fat or fat-free formulas and not gotten 40% of their calories from digestible fat and having inadequate brain function. Now, I realize that's not the cure-all for everything. I have one child who tends to be very attention deficit, and it's a chemical hereditary condition that we have to work with in other ways. But for enormous numbers of children, that's a real key factor. And it's interesting that mother's milk is just over 40% fat. So we have the purest food for a baby available, meeting scientific guidelines. It's amazing when that happens, isn't it? People are always so surprised. But we need to get more fat into the American diet, not less. But the key word in that study, now we've never heard anything else about that study, because right after that we realized that everybody in America is dying of high cholesterol, so everybody had to go on a fat-free diet. And we've not heard anything else on that particular study. But we have everybody in America eating lots and lots of fat, but the key word in that study was digestible fat. Fat that the body can utilize. And the body can only utilize certain types of fat. In order to digest fat, you have to use enzymes. And those enzymes have to be able to plug into the molecules. And if you could imagine a fat molecule being shaped like this, it's not, but just imagine. Okay, and you have an opening here where this enzyme is going to plug in and unlock it so that the energy from that fat is used in the body effectively. What you have instead is a hydrogen molecule plugged in there to keep oxygen from getting in there, to keep it from oxidizing and becoming rancid, because then oil is foul. Rancid oil is very, very harmful to the body, and it smells bad and it tastes yucky. But if you can plug that hydrogen molecule in there and hydrogenate the fat, it doesn't happen. The oil will last forever and ever and ever and ever and ever and ever, and that usually will settle on your thighs and in your shoulders and under the bust and all those other places, okay? Now, where is that digestive enzyme going to fit? There is nowhere for it to go when the hydrogen molecule is plugged in there. So that fat molecule sits in the body, and the body really tries hard to break it down, but it can't. And so you tend up storing fat. Now, I've said in other classes, one of the places that the body will store toxic matter just to protect itself is in fat cells. So there are other reasons for fat, too. But having the wrong kinds of fat in the diet causes the severe stress because you have something that cannot be utilized and cannot be broken down, even to be properly eliminated from the body. So what's a digestible fat? A digestible fat, obviously, is first off something that has not been hydrogenated. I have told people for years that if it was my body, what I do in my diet is we eat butter. We do not eat margarine. We don't even eat margarine from the health food store because it's still hydrogenated. And people have laughed, and people have told me that I was causing people to be unhealthy and all kinds of other things. And last summer, there was a study released that said that when you eat margarine, which is a hydrogenated fat, that it causes the body to produce something called a trans fatty acid, which will actually increase the low-density lipids in the body. So you're going to increase the amount of bad cholesterol that the body has by eating a hydrogenated fat, by eating this margarine, whereas butter will not do that. So you ended up producing more cholesterol than the butter had in it by eating the margarine. So their solution, of course, is don't eat either one. You know, go to setting butter-flavored granules or something, which I definitely don't think is the answer. One of the interesting things to me is that the fat-dependent organs in the body, there are 4, are the brain, the liver, the thymus gland, and the reproductive organs. And that's where most of our American health crises are coming from, our reproductive systems. I mean, it's enormous, the number of women who cannot bear children, and the number of women who have terrible menopausal problems and terrible PMS, and so forth, because the reproductive organs are just not functioning correctly. We have all of our environmental stresses and all of the allergies, which come, in most cases, from a liver that's under acute stress, not able to function properly. And we have all of our nervous disorders and all of our hyperstress and all of our children on Ritalin, which is a brain function. And those are the 4 organs that are definitely fat dependent. What I consider to be digestible sources of fat, and realize in all of this, I am not God. I am not a medical expert, and I'm not here to talk to you about your diseases. I'm here to talk to you about my own experiences from health. I'm here to give you this information that you can choose to use how you want to. You have the right and should have the responsibility to get this information and to use it as you see fit in your own lives. But what I consider to be digestible fats are butter, sour cream, the real stuff, not the artificial sour cream flavored stuff that you put on instead, real sour cream, your raw vegetable oils. Okay, most people are familiar with olive oil, which increases the high-density lipids as well, which that's the happy cholesterol. That's how you can remember it, okay? HDL is happy, and LDLs are lousy. So that might help a little bit. But what you want to do is get fats in there the body can use. The other oils that I use personally are, I use canola oil a great deal. I use sesame oil, walnut oil, and almond oil. I don't cook a lot with almond oil, but occasionally. I like when I'm stir frying, I'll use a mixture of the sesame and canola. The reason that I use those particular oils are just their nutritional profile, but also the fact that they become rancid. They don't become rancid until a very high temperature. For a while, one of the trends was safflower oil. And safflower is a wonderful oil for topical use. It's a great oil for a salad dressing. But it becomes rancid at a very low temperature, and so it's not an oil to be cooked with, even to bake with. Canola is rapeseed oil. And it's an excellent oil as far as its nutritional profile, and it's very bland. And so for most people who are switching from a commercial processed vegetable oil blend, the canola is an easy transition. Now, what most people don't realize about oils is the way that they're processed. You know, in the olden days, in the Middle East, they have huge grinding wheels, presses, stone presses, where they would press the olives to get the olive oil. And that's the way that oils have typically been extracted. And if your olive oil says virgin or extra virgin, that's how it's been extracted. Most of the commercial oils, though, are chemically expressed. They take a solvent, kind of like a dry cleaning fluid, and they throw the corn or the peanuts or whatever the substance is into a vat with this solvent, and the oil separates as the stuff disintegrates. The oil will float to the top, and then that oil is skimmed and bottled and hydrogenated and so forth. But that means you're going to have that chemical residue there. With the last levels of olive oil, other than the virgin or extra virgin, they're able legally to do the same thing. By definition, they cannot do that with the virgin or extra virgin. So if your oil does not say on it mechanically pressed or cold pressed, then it's been either extracted under extreme heat and pressure or with the chemical solvents. And you want to avoid those because they contaminate the oil and cause stress to the liver, which again needs that fat to process itself. One of the big things that people come up with as far as fat and diet is dairy products. And there are all these people with taboos saying, yes, but milk allergies are responsible for all the ear infections and all the allergies and all the rest of it. And for some people, I think that that's true. When my children are sick, they are not permitted any dairy products. Micah, my oldest that I've talked about at other times, who's had the sinus problems as a child, was not allowed dairy products for almost 2 years. I didn't let him have any dairy products. It was simply too hard for him to digest. I am not anti-dairy, and at this point in my home, in a normal week, we'll go through about 2.5 pounds of cheese and a gallon of milk and a couple quarts of yogurt and sour cream we always have around. The yogurt and the cheeses, raw milk cheeses are typically what I use, have enzyme activity that has taken place, and that's one of the benefits of sour cream. Sour cream, I think, is one of the single best foods for the liver. But those things, we've talked about enzymes with raw foods, and the yogurt, the kefir, the sour cream, buttermilk, those things all have cultured themselves or added cultures added to them that changes the structure and makes it very easy for the body to utilize it. And some of you have probably seen the stories about how the longest-lived people in all of the long-lived cultures in the world, they're consuming some kind of a dairy product on a regular basis. They're consuming a kefir or a yogurt, but it's always a cultured dairy product. What's happened today with the dairy industry is that we no longer have whole milk available, frankly. And I'm not talking about just at a health or a fast food restaurant where they only have skim milk or 2% milk available. But whole milk, by definition in our country, has been changed. Now, in the old days, the cream would settle. You'd get your bottle of milk, and you would have cream floating at the top. And you always knew how good your milk was and what kind of cow it was coming from because of the amount of cream that you got. And that's where, the cream of the crop or skimming the till, those expressions come from taking some of the cream off and still calling it milk. Well, the farmers had a quandary because they wanted to sell milk, but they also wanted to sell cream because you can't make whipped cream from milk. You can only use the cream. And so they went to the government, and the government issued standards and said, okay, we'll say that 4% is whole milk. And so all milk today, when it's commercially processed, is skimmed. Cream is skimmed, and then they add fat back into it, the milk fat, to make it exactly 4% or exactly 2% or exactly 1%. So you get your low-fat, your skim, or your whole milk. And they still sell the cream, okay? Now, in that process of losing the cream, you lose the balance of the food. The body doesn't break protein down without fat. One of the fears of the Indians, everyone knows that they dried their buffalo meat and so forth, and if you've ever dried meat, you have to remove all of the fat. or the fat will rot and become rancid, like we've talked about, and then the whole jerky or whatever will not be as tasty or as effective. But they also stored the fat. They would render the fat and they would store it because they knew that they could die eating nothing but the dried meat over a long period of time. Now, a scout out for 3 or 4 days is not going to have a problem. But somebody, if the whole tribe was living on nothing but meat for the whole winter, they would have a health problem if they couldn't occasionally boil it up with some of the fat. So the rendered fat was very, very important. And that's what we need to make sure we've got in our diet. So when you're taking in like the skim milk, you have a protein that the body is going to have an extremely difficult time breaking down, and so you end up with a lot of kidney stress because of this protein that the body can't really use because the fat is missing. I think that some of the other good sources of fat are nuts, and I think nuts are one of the best foods that most of us can be eating, and that's one food. I'm going to talk in a minute about natural and organic foods, but the nuts are one food that is very, very important be organic, because a nut is the ovary, essentially. Okay, it's a ripe fruit of the tree, and those, as ovaries, as reproductive organs, they tend to collect the pesticides and so forth. And so it's very important that you don't have a nut that's been heavily sprayed and treated, because you're going to have a higher concentration of that substance there than you would have in other situations. So nuts are one of the best foods, I believe. And I think the 2 best nuts are almonds and cashews. Both of them have very, very strong immunostimulant properties. And so they're really, really good at getting the immune system functional. Peanuts, incidentally, are not a nut. They're a legume. And a lot of people find, especially if they've had traditional yeast problems or fungus problems or so forth, that peanuts seem to aggravate it. Or that they crave peanuts because the peanuts feed those conditions, those organisms. And so we need to kind of stay away from those a little bit. They're very high in something called an aflatoxin. It's just an inherent part of the way that it grows. All right, one of the last things that I want to mention about milk is that when milk is homogenized, which is when they use pressure to homogenize milk. Someone told me once, the same dairyman, that it's equivalent to the pressure of trying to force a fire hose through a window screen. All right? But they use that kind of pressure, and it shatters the fat molecules in the milk. So that's why you don't get the milk with the cream settling on the top anymore. The molecules have been shattered so finely that they can't find each other anymore, and they can't clump back together. But being made that small, they also are no longer limited to the digestive system to get out into the bloodstream, that they are so small that they can actually migrate through the cell walls and can get into the bloodstream on their own. So now we understand why we have fat particles, actual fat particles in people's blood. All right? So those particles get in there. There is no digestive capacity within the bloodstream itself, and so you've got these fat molecules circulating through the body that you cannot do anything with, and they are going to tend to accumulate. And if you're eating the hydrogenated fats and you have all the free radicals floating around and you've already chipped off the lining of your arteries, and so you've got that Teflon smooth lining is gone, and you've got little spaces where one of those molecules can stick, and then another one comes along and it sticks right to that one, and you end up building these fat deposits that simply are fat molecules migrated into the blood that would never have been there had they not been put into that form. I really feel that its simplest ways that you can control your diet are, first, as I said, to eat raw foods at every meal. Second, to eat foods the way they were made for you to eat them. There's a reason why there's a hull on your rice. Now, that doesn't mean you have to eat a pecan in the shell. I mean, we've got some common sense that we can use here. But if there is not a reason that something would be harmful and detrimental to the body to eat it, then you should eat it. I learned that lesson from Rachel. My kids all love kiwi fruit. And I was cutting up kiwi fruit one day, and I was peeling that fuzzy stuff off the outside of the kiwi. And Rachel was coming up behind me and grabbing it and sticking it in her mouth. She was about 6 at the time. She didn't see any reason why you shouldn't eat fuzzy stuff. Now, we don't do it because of the aesthetics. It feels funny in your mouth. She loves kiwi skins. And do you know what? If you eat a kiwi or a piece of a kiwi with the skin on it, short of the stem end where it's really hard, the textures of the two are actually complementary, and it's not unpleasant at all. Now, who would ever think to eat kiwi fruit? It just, I would never have done it had Rachel not done it all by herself. So, it's an aesthetic thing that we have to get over and maybe think a little bit differently. I make my mashed potatoes with the skins on. There's a chain restaurant that's making a lot of money because they do the same thing, and I've always done that. So that's another rule. Eat it the way that it was made for you. It was created with wisdom, and it just works right. The third thing goes right along with that one, and that is to eat foods in their season. Now, we don't have to do that anymore. We have refrigerated trucks, and we were talking during one of the breaks about how, if you were a milk farmer, you would drink lots of milk, but you weren't eating lots of meat. And if you were a rancher, you would eat lots of meat, but you weren't eating lots of dairy products because you were killing your cows. And, that people ate what they produced and what they had around them. And we don't have to do that anymore because we can get the milk from the one guy and the meat from the other guy and everything from everybody else. And we can get it from all around the world. So even if it's not strawberry season here, it's strawberry season somewhere, and we can get them. But if you'll follow the seasons, you'll see that there's great wisdom in the way that foods come into season. And going along with that is also eating the foods that are locally produced. We live in Florida, and there are so many people in this state, even in the central part of the state, which is still somewhat tropical, that have never tasted a star fruit, that don't eat mango, that don't eat those fruits that grow locally, and always those foods are the foods that are the healthiest for the body. In tropical climates, one of the problems because of the humidity is fungal infections. And a very acidic food neutralizes fungus infections. And so we tend to have a lot of very, very acidy foods growing in these climates. We have the Eskimo who live on blubber and very, very high-fat fish who incidentally have no incidence of cholesterol or heart disease living on blubber and fresh fish, fresh fatty fish. But they need that extra fat to keep their bodies warm. And so they've got that there. Meat's a hot-burning protein, and the other caution that I use with meat is that in the summertime we eat very little of it. When it's cold out, you need that extra heat generated that the meat will do for you. In the wintertime, honestly, do you sit on the beach dreaming about burgers or a big steak, or do you sit on the beach thinking about lemonade and watermelon? We know what we need, and wisdom has placed us with the right foods in the right places at the right times. And most of us, because we don't have gardens, we're not in touch with that. We really don't know what's in season at any given time. One of the other fun things about seasonal foods was that they found that those foods that are out of season in the supermarket tend to be much, much higher in pesticides and in other toxic chemicals for two reasons. One being that being shipped so far, they usually have extra chemicals added. They actually fumigate boxes of sweet potatoes and so forth. Because of the transport, they don't want bugs crawling in and out of the cartons and eating the food. And so they fumigate the whole cartons. And many times you'll see, if you've ever gone to a supermarket or a produce stand and gotten boxes, on the cartons from the potatoes and sweet potatoes, it will say, box treated with. And it will name some horrible chemical that they spray and fumigate that whole shipment with, or the box itself with, in order to prevent the bugs from getting into that substance. The other thing that they do, though, is that the chemicals that we have banned in our country, we still produce, but we ship them out. We export them to Central and South America especially, so that the grapes that we're getting in today from Chile may have very high levels of things like DDT. We don't use them, but we make it and sell it to them, and they use it. And since they don't have the same constraints ecologically that we now have, those foods tend to be much higher in pesticides. Which brings me to the next topic, which is, what is natural food? Natural is a word that means absolutely nothing in your supermarket. Natural flavors are things that taste like something natural or were originally extracted from a substance that occurs in nature. And so something like monosodium glutamate, MSG, which swells your taste buds, which is why it makes everything come alive with flavor, is considered a natural flavor. So natural flavor doesn't mean anything. One of the big victims, I think, of that has been the herbal teas. Everybody thinks herbal teas are so neat and so healthy and they don't have caffeine and all the rest of it, but they all have these natural flavors. Now, I hate to tell you, but raspberry tea, raspberry leaf tea, does not taste remotely like raspberries. You don't put raspberries in raspberry leaf tea, but raspberry leaf tea that you buy today over the counter has raspberry leaves and rose hips and chicory and natural flavors. And boy, it's like drinking raspberry fizz. There's a raspberry jumping out of the cup at you. And it's that natural flavor that does it. So learn to read your labels. Organic means carbon-based, essentially. But organic foods do have a difference. Not in all states. But if you find something, it will very often say certified organically grown in accordance with California statute, whatever the number is. California was the first state to actually set up standards and say, okay, if you're going to call this food organically produced, it has to be, I think it's 7 years that that soil has not been treated with pesticides or chemical fertilizers. We've talked at other times about the food only being able to have in it what was in the soil for it to draw from, and that's why tomatoes don't taste like tomatoes anymore. They're missing some 23, I think, nutrients that used to be in tomatoes in the 1940s and aren't today because they're not put into the soil. We don't farm correctly anymore. We don't rotate the soil and so forth. But California organic statute stipulates 7 years without pesticides. They stipulate that the crops can't be sprayed. They can't have the synthetic things added and so forth. And so most states have used, or most companies have utilized that statute because it's been in existence for so long and because it's so strict. And that's why in Florida or whatever you'll see that. It's like the regulated by or registered with the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture that you see on all the boxes of stuff. And so organic, if it says that, does mean something, assuming that you have a reputable dealer. Your retailer is reputable and so forth. And typically that food itself will be labeled. It will have a sticker. It will have a rubber band with a tag or something that's labeled that way. With muscle response testing, I have been in too many health food stores that are saying this is organic lettuce, that it isn't. If it's organic, then I don't know what they're doing between the crop and the store, but it will not muscle test well at all. And I've been in stores where literally what was labeled organic tested out much worse than what was labeled commercial. So just be aware that you need to be the one that's responsible and conscious of what you're buying. And I'm not trying to scare you away from organic foods at all. I really feel that wherever I have the opportunity to buy organic foods, I do. Whether it's an organically grown grain that's being used in a flour or an organically grown vegetable or fruit, I will always go organic. And it will usually be more expensive. That's coming down. And the reason it's coming down is because there have been people willing to pay the difference and to keep the farmers alive long enough for enough other farmers to say, gee, maybe this would work, and jump on the bandwagon. And so we're increasing production and we're making it easier for that food to be distributed and so forth. But realize with an organic crop, you're going to have more spoilage in transit. With an organic crop, you're going to have more stuff that does get eaten and you can't sell it. Costs are higher for an organic farmer because of the losses and so forth. Costs are higher because organic farmers typically also want their food to be ripe when they pick it. So they don't ship it all across the country and grow in huge volume. And it means that some of the tomatoes end up bruised and they can't ship them or sell them at all. Whereas everyone else buys the tomatoes green. They are sent to warehouses. Bananas are done this way too, where they are gassed in the warehouse with the gas that causes them to ripen immediately. And if you've ever had a tree-ripened banana, in Florida we have those things, you wonder where they ever got these other things because they are not the same fruit. There is no comparison between a banana that comes off a tree and a banana that comes out of a supermarket. They just don't taste the same way. But bananas take forever to get ripe if you've ever grown them. They look at you. They stay there on the counter. And it takes literally weeks for bananas to ripen when you buy them that have not been gassed. So there are these other things that happen that we're not aware of. That's the reason why I support wholesale food warehouses, the cooperatives that distribute health foods, rather than a supermarket that's selling the same product. Because I know that conscientious warehouse, the distributors, the wholesale distributors, the cooperatives and so forth, are also not fumigating their stuff. You can buy organic produce from a supermarket, but they do fumigate their warehouses. And they do use commercial pesticides in their stockrooms and so forth that are labeled as food safe, but that I would never eat or utilize. And so we've got, companies, if there's a social consciousness there of, do I want to support this company? What kind of causes does this corporation support? Social issues. What kind of economics are they supporting? They sell this, but do they also sell other things that are, they've got organic produce in one aisle and the commercial bug sprays on the next aisle. Is there consistency here? So those are issues that you have to look at for yourself. But the organic foods have been studied out by the Department of Agriculture, and they found out that, surprisingly enough, organic foods really were more nutritious. Now, there are studies that will say, but it's only got the same amount of this or whatever, but they actually finally sat down about 3 years ago. They did a study. They found that the iron content of spinach that was organically raised was 4 times the iron content of spinach that was commercially raised. And people usually are eating spinach expecting it to be high in iron. And so there were definite differences. They tested 7 different foods in that. From the pesticide residue, there was I think it was 48 hours program on about a year ago, which was really interesting because they said that, according to the FDA, that only, 3% or some incredibly small amount of the food that was actually in the supermarket had any residue, measurable residue, of pesticides. And so they took their agents, their undercover people, and they followed, I think, 5 families through the supermarket. They just, went and did their regular shopping, and they followed these families around. And then they bought exactly what these families bought. 5 packs of grapes or 2 cantaloupes, whatever it was that they were buying. And they took that bag of produce to an independent laboratory and asked the laboratory to analyze these same foods. And then they contacted these families and had them all come together, and they interviewed the chemist that had done the analysis. And they had done an interview on videotape, and they were sitting there, and one of the women was literally sitting there crying, watching this interview, because she is so conscientious and she's trying so hard to get her family to eat all these extra fruits and vegetables. And the residues on some of these products were 4 and 5 and 6 times the legal limit in this country. And that's really scary when you watch the rest of the program, which said that the legal limit in our country is much, much, much higher than the legal limit in most other countries. Europe has not allowed American beef to be imported into its continent for years because of the levels of chemical in the meat. They simply will not allow it. And in this program, they tracked strawberries from Florida, and they took them to the Canadian border, and they were turned down flat. It was just a bulk shipment, and they said that this is very common. It was, I don't remember the figure, it was, 30 or 40% of the strawberries that America tries to ship to Canada are rejected because they cannot meet the Canadian standard. And there was one particular fungicide that they had determined is enormously costly to the body, and the Canadian level of it is extremely low, and that's the one that we use all the time. And so they went to the FDA and they said, why is it that you can let these strawberries get sold in this country, but you can't let them get sold in Canada? And the American level, I think, was 7 times higher than the Canadian level for this particular fungicide. And so the gentleman that they were interviewing said that it is written into our law that whenever they're evaluating situations like this, that they are required by statute to consider the economic interest of the grower and to weigh that against the potential health risks. And so we've got to balance how many strawberry farmers we want to lose money versus how many people we're willing to let suffer. So that's a mandatory contest that we have going in this country. Those are the kinds of issues you need to study, that you need to be aware of. That's why it makes a difference when you buy the organic produce, because you're sending a message that says, we don't want this stuff either. Because right now, the government thinks they're doing us a favor. They're allowing strawberry farmers to stay in business, but they're doing it at our expense. And so there is a difference to buying organic food. There is a difference to eating food in its natural state, which to me is not natural flavored toffee bars. It's natural in the way that it was created, in the way that it was placed here for us to use. And that's a little bit of a bigger step, because we are a box and can society, and those are the things you have to get away from. Food that supports the body. I promised I would give you some of that kind of information. When I do my private consultations, after we've finished everything, and I'll say, okay, now we came up with, we really need to work at supporting this particular organ or this particular body system, one of the things that I try to do for my clients is to give them a list of foods that will help that particular organ. Now, most people know that yogurt, whole milk, live culture yogurt, which you must get at a health food store for it to have enough live culture to really make a difference, is really good for diarrhea. I mean, it helps with the intestinal flora replacement. A lot of women use it for yeast infections. They actually did some medical studies and said, yes, if you douched with yogurt or used an application, like an internal applicator, and put some yogurt into the vaginal canal, that it would stop a yeast infection. And this was in one of the women's magazines, and it said, but wait, before you get really excited, the only 2 yogurts that actually worked were, and it was 2 brands that are only available at the health food store. And it's because the count of the bacteria is so low in the others. If you've ever bought yogurt at a health food store and compared it to the commercial yogurt, one is a gelatiny, very firm consistency, and the other is very, very creamy, even if it's not the whole milk variety, which again I think is much easier for the body to break down. And it's because of the range of cultures and the quantity of cultures that are present in that yogurt. But it's also true that just as that particular food helps that particular system, the color of food is a really good key as to what's going to be most beneficial to the body. Because what gives a food its color is the mineral content. Certain minerals cause certain colorations and so forth. And every organ in the body has a different nutritional need. And so with working with the digestive system, the stomach tends to be very stimulated by yellow foods. Those are just the things that are very high in it. There aren't a whole lot of bright yellow foods. Yellow squash. Can't think of a lot of others. Butter. But people used to eat things like flowers. Now, I talked about nuts having the high levels of pesticides, but nuts have one other advantage. And speaking of nuts, one other oil source that I think is excellent personally is avocado. Yes, they are high in fat, but remember, fat is critical for your success. Okay, you have to be fat. So you can go home. People love it when they come to my office because I send them home and tell them to eat raw milk or whole milk and sour cream if they're going to eat dairy products. And they think that's really cool. And do you know, I am not killing people in my office. I'm not treating cholesterol problems, but I can tell you that a lot of people have come to my office, started getting their digestive system to work, gone home in the process and switched to whole milk, and their cholesterol has gone down. The body is not under stress anymore. 80% of their cholesterol is being produced by their liver. If the liver is under stress from hydrogenated fats, from other substances and chemicals in the body, the liver is going to overproduce or screw around with your cholesterol figures. So just get that organ functioning. And remember, we said sour cream is one of the best, and you don't have to deal with the fat issue. Okay? Anyway, I lost my whole train of thought now. Stomach. Okay. So yellow foods are one of the foods that tend to be balancing and stimulating to the stomach. One of the other foods that's really important for the stomach are the aromatic herbs, the aromatic spices. When you have something going on in your kitchen with ginger, with cinnamon, with cloves, with garlic, with onions, what happens? Your stomach starts to growl. Your mouth starts to water. Those are aromatic herbs. And in our culture, because we tend to approach even herbs very medicinally, very analytically, very therapeutically, we don't think of a lot of those things as medicinal. Cinnamon is a very valuable herb in both Chinese and Ayurvedic medicine. Nutmeg is another one. They're carminatives. They're herbs that tend to stimulate the digestive system. So the aromatics are very, very helpful in the digestive process. And those are foods that everybody has in their spice drawer. And what do? You pull them out at Christmas when you're going to make cookies. And once at Thanksgiving to make a pie, and the nutmeg stays on the shelf for the rest of the year. And that's why one bottle that you get before your wedding lasts you until you pass it to your grandchildren at your funeral. Those things should be in your stuff all the time, okay? Ginger, incidentally, is very, very wonderful for calming a stomach. It's a little queasy. And one of the old herbal composition powder, it was called Samuel Thompson formula, Christopher formulas, was ginger and cloves as the base because they tend to heat the body up, they cause you to perspire and so forth. But they also, again, carminative herbs that help with the digestion. And so those aromatic herbs and the yellow foods are what's going to be most beneficial to the stomach. And again, slightly acid foods. Now, isn't that interesting? I talked about lemons in the water. Lemons are yellow. Okay, the pancreas is most stimulated by foods that are orange. What color is the roof of every fast food restaurant you've ever seen? Orange. Think about them. All the chains have orange in their decor. And the reason for that is that it literally stimulates the pancreas. I had a consumer psychology course in college, and one of the projects that I had to do was a color psychology project. And every color has a certain connotation emotionally. I mean, we think of red light districts, not lavender light districts, right? Not yellow light districts. and because of the emotional connotation of those colors, but they also have very physical responses in the body. And orange connotes to the psychological makeup of people richness and depth and warmth and, you know, the fireplace at night, it's cozy, it's safe, it's secure. And so when I was doing my color psychology thing, the ad that I came up with was a brandy ad. You know, and the firelight flickering with this big bottle with the gold and orange and amber highlights. And that's why you've got those orange chairs and orange roofs and orange counters, because you get to it and you think, and the pancreas gets active and starts, you know, your pancreas does two things. It produces digestive enzymes and it produces insulin. So we've got a sugar thing happening, and we have a starch thing happening. And so you want it right now, the cinnamon biscuits or the burger with the big flaky crust and, you know, the breading on the fish. And there's so much starch there because that's what the body's activated to crave when it sees the orange. So you just blindfold yourself to orange when you drive past fast food restaurants. But you can use that to your advantage with the orange foods, sweet potatoes, cantaloupe, pumpkins, apricots, peaches, nectarines. Those foods, all that have the orange in them, tend to be the ones that are the most stimulating and balancing. And don't look just to the fruits. We tend to do a better job eating fruits in our culture than vegetables. But those vegetables, pumpkins, are very, very good nutrients for the body. And you know, you can make waffles with pumpkin in them, and they're wonderful. I was going to make a pumpkin pie Monday night. I got proposed to instead, so I didn't have to make pumpkin pie. But I had this can of pumpkin in my kitchen, and I thought, oh, cool, I haven't had a pumpkin pie since Christmas. That sounds wonderful. You know, so get creative. Use some of those things. Bake your sweet potatoes. I don't fry foods a whole lot. When I do fry them, I always use the oil, the cold-pressed oil. And I only use the oil once, and that's why it's expensive, and so you don't fry a whole lot when you do that. But every time you reheat the oil, you get it closer to being rancid, and you increase the free radical activity in that oil every time you heat it. So that's one of the real dangers of, you know, the fast foods, where you've got the same oil being used over and over and over at a very high temperature. Okay, it depends. Okay, so but when I do make French fries, we make French fries from regular potatoes and French fries from sweet potatoes. My kids love them. So think creatively. You can bake a sweet potato as easily as you can bake a potato, and use those foods in ways that you haven't maybe tried before. Just get creative, and you will be amazed at what your kids will do. I mean, they really will surprise you if you are willing to stick your neck out a little bit. We did a 12-course madrigal dinner as a school project one time. My family, I homeschool my children, and we spent a year studying the Middle Ages. And we only once, and we'll never do it again, did a 12-course meal for 63 people. And one of you know, we served things, I got it with the yellow. One of the things that yellow foods is dandelion petals. Now, in America, we don't eat flowers. And when I was talking about nuts and things, one of the advantages to nuts, especially if they're organically grown, is they contain hormones in them. They actually contain prostaglandins, which is what your body uses to stimulate the production of hormones. And so one of the major health researchers in our time has suggested that perhaps one of the reasons we have so many glandular and hormonal problems in our country is that we do not eat nuts and seeds, which is where we get those prostaglandins. And we also don't eat flowers, and flowers also have those prostaglandins in them. And in the Middle Ages, they ate flowers all the time. So we had whipped cream with, Swithin cream, it was called, whipped cream with dandelion petals in it. And they're really very tasty. They're sweet. So there's a yellow food that you could try this summer. Do it from your backyard after you've stopped spraying it, you know, not from just walking along the street, because who knows what you're going to get that way. Lost my train of thought again. This is terrible. Where was I? Pumpkin pies, orange foods. So use those foods in ways that you maybe haven't thought of before. You can eat nasturtium petals also. They're orange. But getting those orange foods in there, that's real easy to do, especially the vegetables. The liver, which is what produces most of those precursor enzymes or hormones that cause the rest of the body to function correctly, is triggered especially by foods that are very dark red and foods that are dark green. So your green leafy things like kale and collards and spinach are excellent, but so are things like beets. And anytime you have the choice to choose between red and green or red and yellow, like red onions over yellow onions, red cabbage over green cabbage, or at least mix the two together, and you dramatically increase the nutrient level that's available to the liver from that particular food. So again, just be creative and try something different. I don't remember if I said it in the last class, but it was really funny. When I was a little girl, my grandparents were fruit farmers, and they always had a huge truck patch. And when we would come home to visit in the summer, one of the things that they used to do was they'd sit around before bedtime and eat. and they'd usually pull out tea and cookies or something that my grandmother had baked, but they'd also always pull out stuff, fresh stuff, and one of the most popular things was to pull out a head of cabbage and just cut off these huge wedges of cabbage and smear them with mayonnaise, and we'd all sit around the table eating cabbage and mayonnaise. And I remember my mom one time getting very concerned that we were all going to go to bed with these terrible, terrible stomach aches, and I don't remember it ever happening. But kids will do that. I did it, and I was raised in your normal American diet. My mom was a classic cook, And I thought it was really cool to sit around and eat pieces of cabbage with mayonnaise on them. So, give your kids the benefit of the doubt. But back to this medieval festival, what was really interesting to me was how many of the parents were turning up their noses and making a big scene about that stuff. What is this? First thing, you'd hand it to them, and we had pages serving the food, and we had a royal tester and everything, and we'd walk up with this tray, and they were supposed to be acting like lords and ladies, and they'd go, what is it? Before they'd even take it, and we had roast capon and all kinds of exciting things. But what was funny was there was one couple that was really, really unpleasant every time you'd take them the dish. And they had a son who was a junior at the time in high school and would not even sit at the table and was running around and leaving and kept walking around saying, when can this be done? I want to go to Burger King. I'm starving and you're not feeding me. And they were very, very upset with their son. They thought he was being completely rude. They didn't know where he'd gotten his manners. And you just better shut up till this is over, and then we'll go get some food. I'm thinking, we need a big looking glass, a classic medieval framed looking glass here. And I think that a lot of you could use one of those mirrors. And you don't do it intentionally with broccoli. I hate broccoli. I've always hated broccoli. I never ate broccoli. So try it raw. You never did that before. Give it a chance, or at least bluff it good for your kids' sake. Okay, give them a chance to try something. Even if you don't like it, serve it and smile pretty and let them try. You might be surprised what they'll eat. All right, so your liver, you want those red foods. You want those green leafy things. One of the other organs that is very much impacted by food is your kidneys. And I talked a little bit about the stress that can go onto kidneys by eating the proteins that aren't mixed with fat properly and so forth. But therapeutically, you can do a lot with the kidneys to strengthen them with some of the juices. Most people are familiar with cranberry juice for the kidneys, but there's one problem with cranberry juice. Cranberry juice is very astringent. And so if you've got inflammation in the kidneys and so forth, the cranberry juice will help tighten it down. Because it's so acidic, it helps to flush out bacteria. And there is another enzyme in cranberry that they're now crediting with actually being able to be antibacterial. It kills bacteria in the urinary tract. But remember we said earlier that sugar feeds bacteria? And most of your commercial cranberry juice products are loaded with sugar. It's either corn syrup or just sugar flat out or some kind of a sweetener. At the health food store, your blends are usually very high in white grape juice from concentrate, which is probably the most concentrated sugar you can get from a natural form. And so you want to avoid those also, especially if you're dealing in a therapeutic condition where you've got an infection. It's really important to get the cranberry concentrate that has not been sweetened. And you can mix it with some apple juice, mix it with pineapple juice, which is another juice that's extremely beneficial to the kidneys. Mix it with some apricot juice, but black cherry is another excellent one for the kidneys and the liver. Something that's going to sweeten it without any kind of concentrated sugars, because you're just accelerating the rate of the bacterial growth when you do that. So the pineapple juice is very high in ash, which is helpful to the kidneys. And the black cherry juice is very, very sweet. And again, what do you have? That dark red color that's going to strengthen the liver. And if the liver is detoxifying the blood or detoxifying the body more effectively, it's going to remove the strain on the kidneys. Pineapple juice is the one juice that you can get at any supermarket if you buy the top labels. I usually will buy the Dole. That just can't be completely damaged. The papain or the vermilion in pineapple is such a powerful enzyme that even canning it doesn't wipe it out. So pineapple juice is one of the most therapeutic juices that everybody has access to. Your apple juice is very good for opening the bile ducts in the liver. Sometimes people will find that it will help with nausea for that reason if you sip on the apple juice. Concentrated juices I try to avoid. And again, in the health food store, it's not as people used to believe it was safe just to go to the health food store and then you could eat anything in there and you'd be fine. There are products in the health food store that are deadly at this point, not because they're herbs that are going to kill you, but because they've got more sugar in them than they have in the commercial products. They will actually have sugar, white sugar stuff in a lot of the health food products. They've got the hydrogenated oils. They've got artificial flavors. They've got a lot of other things added to them because it's such a big market right now. It's just really profitable to market a health product. And so you have to be very, very conscious of what you're looking at when you go shopping. So the juices from concentrate, when you concentrate something, you take it and you boil it down. Your cherry juice or apricot juice or whatever. And so you are going to impact the enzymes that are there. You're going to concentrate the sugars, and you're going to remove the water. And then they're going to go back and they're going to put other water back in to rehydrate it. Now, you don't know what kind of water they're using to rehydrate it, but I can guarantee you it was not as good as the water that God put in it. And so your juices from concentrate are not the ideal way to go. Your pure fruit juices, your pressed apple juices and so forth are much more nutritious. I do caution against juices in general. I have said before to drink your fruit juices diluted. And the reason for that is that you have no fiber to slow down the way that the body breaks the sugars down in that juice. So you can sit down and drink 14 or 15 apples. You can't possibly eat 14 or 15 apples. But because of it being all in a liquid form. And if you're doing that, as a juice fast for a specific health concern, that's a different situation. But on a regular basis, you don't want to be drinking huge amounts of fruit juice, even a good cold-pressed natural juice, because you are going to be very much increasing the sugar level in the body. And that's not necessary. So if you find that you start diluting them with water, most people cannot drink a straight fruit juice. It just is too sweet, even for someone who's used to commercial drinks. To drink straight strawberry juice or straight apricot juice is just overwhelming.
What's going for the kidneys?
The kidneys are best benefited by the pineapple juice, the black cherry. It's not a color issue for the kidneys. No. All right. I wanted also to cover a little bit of what I call first aid from the kitchen. That's one of my favorite workshops to do. I like teaching that one because I go in usually with, just a box full of stuff and say, this is my first aid kit. And I have a regular, commercial first aid, herbal first aid kit that I produce with extracts, herbal extracts and so forth. But in the middle of the night, when you don't even have that around, it's really nice to know you can do something with what you've got on hand. One of the first steps that I suggest to most people to do with their diet is to change from eating iceberg lettuce to a leaf lettuce. That's really easy. It doesn't cost much more. It doesn't make a lot of taste difference. It looks prettier, and it removes enormous amounts of pesticide because that happens to be one of the highest plants in pesticide residue in your supermarket. But an iceberg lettuce head is fairly high in opiates. And so if you have a case of vomiting that just will not stop, you can take a half a head of iceberg lettuce and throw it into your blender and whip it up into a liquid and strain it and drink it, and it will usually calm the vomiting very, very quickly because of the opiates that are in there. I don't keep that in my kitchen anyway, to be frank, because I usually would use ginger or something else or a homeopathic solution. But if I had a situation where nothing else had worked, I could really quickly and easily get a hold of some iceberg lettuce. Or if I was at a hotel somewhere and had nothing with me at all, I could run downstairs and grab some iceberg lettuce and throw it in the blender. So those are little things that make a big difference. One of the other really therapeutic foods is this. Okay, cabbage. And I understand why now. Cabbage leaves used to be used, they would mash them up and make poultices. Sometimes they'd boil them, sometimes they would just use them raw, and they would use them to wrap festering wounds. Okay, stuff where nothing would heal, ulcerated skin and so forth. Now, what do we know today about cabbage? What class of foods is it in? There's a real trendy group of foods right now that we're all supposed to be eating lots and lots and lots of. Cruciferous vegetables. And why do we eat cruciferous vegetables? Because they're high in antioxidants and they have that property in the body. Now, if you have a festering sore somewhere or a boil, a pustule that just hasn't gotten any better, do you think that a little bit of extra oxygen in the body might be useful? Sure enough. So you can see how that would work to start fighting infections. So that was another food that's real common that most people don't think of as being very therapeutic. I talked earlier about your spices and having those kinds of things around, especially your aromatic things, ginger and cloves and so forth. But this is an aromatic that gets really overlooked. Now, almost everybody has onions in their house. One of the old cures for an earache that does work is to take half an onion or cut an onion in half and bake them. And then take that warm onion from the oven, bake it till it's soft and juicy, and put it over the affected ear. Now, there is some actual antiseptic property to all the allicins, the onions, garlics, and so forth, actual antibacterial properties and so forth. But onions are also in that same class as the ginger and the cinnamon and the garlic, what happens when you smell it? Everything starts moving in the body. So if you've got stagnant matter in the ear, usually it's in the lymphatic system under the ear, you can take that aromatic oil from the onion is going to start to penetrate, and it's going to increase the circulation there. People also used to use onions for a cure, a poultice, for coughs and so forth. Now, an excellent cough syrup that's easy to make in the middle of the night is to slice up onions just about that thick and throw them in a saucepan and cover them completely with honey and simmer it just till the onions are completely clear. And then drink the syrup, use the cough syrup, and that releases those aromatic oils in, and it's excellent for helping to break stuff loose. It does not taste unpleasant. It becomes very, very sweet. In fact, this is a good vegetable to eat, to bake and eat like a potato. It's very, very tasty that way. You sprinkle some cloves on it and some butter and stuff. But in stirring up that circulation inside, it's going to, again, keep the infection from settling down in the lungs. When I teach the Pioneer Medicine Workshop, I love to tell the story. There's an excellent film called Where the Lilies Bloom. And it's the story, it's based on a true story, I believe, I'm not certain, but it's the story of a family that was orphaned. The mother had died at some point, and the father then died, and the family was afraid, the children, that they would be separated into foster homes. And so they kept the death of their father a secret, and they were supporting themselves by wildcrafting herbs. Well, they had a landlord that they owed a lot of money to, that had taken over their farm, and they hated him, but they went one day to pay the mortgage or take him his potatoes share or something, and he was dying with pneumonia. He was an older single man just laying in his chair, and they were debating, should we just let him die? And then they said, no, but maybe if we did that, then we'd never get our farm back. But if we save his life, he'll have to love us and take care of us, and maybe he'll give us the farm. So they did the onion cure, and all the kids said, oh no, not the onion cure. And they got a 50-pound bag of onions, big bag of onions. And they sliced all the onions, and they boiled the onions, and they buried him in the bathtub in his long underwear in the onions. Now, if you know how much an onion makes your eyes water, and you know that if you've got a fever and you are sick, and that fever breaks, you feel better, can you imagine what would happen with you being buried in hot onions? It's the same principle of a ginger plaster or mustard plaster that they used to use. It's going to get the body moving. Now, most of us are not going to bury ourselves in onions, but you can use the onion syrup as in the cough syrup, or using the onion in the ear with the same kind of results. So that's a good one to have around. Potatoes. Now, I have potato in here for a couple of reasons. Some people have used slices of raw potato because of some of the minerals that are in it, and used it on skin conditions, where there is an erupting condition, like the cabbage, very similar to the way the cabbage works. One of the other things that a potato is really, really good for is that you're peeling. Did you ever cut a potato crosswise? I should have done that. And you know how you see that little dark ring about that far in from the skin? Well, usually when you peel a potato, that's about where you peel it, right? So you wipe all of that off. Well, if you ever have someone who's suffering just from complete depletion, total depletion, an athlete, someone who's just kind of hit the wall and collapsing. I heard about this first from a marathon runner who was running one of these enormous, like 24-hour type marathons, and had crashed and did not want to quit the race. And so what she was told by Jack Richardson to do is to find a restaurant and to go in and ask them to peel some potatoes really thick, like the way my aunt peels potatoes, this thick, lose all that mineral. And then take the peelings and throw them in the pot and throw the rest of the stuff away, because that's just starch. And to boil that up and to drink the broth, and it makes a very, very rich potassium broth, a mineral broth. So I would usually throw in some celery or some carrots or both, add that to it. But it's an excellent broth for someone who's been sick for a long time, or someone who has not been able to keep anything down for a couple of days, because it gets a very, very high level of minerals in there. But again, I don't use the whole potato. The middle part's the part that's not important in that situation. You don't want just blanket starch. You want something that's very, very nutritive. And the potato peeling, if you peel it about that thick, is going to give you all of the minerals coming out of that potato. So that's a really good thing to keep around. This one was kind of a joke. Now, celery is really good for you anyway, and sodium. But when I first talked about first aid for the kitchen, one of my good friends was getting married, and her daughter was about 7 and was dancing around and carrying on and fell and jammed her finger. Not jammed it, sprained it. She bent it backwards, And I mean, it was like turning blue and hurting badly as soon as it happened. So we didn't know what to do with this finger. We didn't want to run out to the emergency room in the middle of the wedding reception. So we grabbed a stick of celery and we broke it off, and we took ribbon from a present and we made her a perfect splint. Something creatively. This one's in there almost as a joke. But celery is very high in sodium, okay, which is very, very critical as a trace mineral for the body. And so by putting that on there, it was very, very cooling. Celery, as in a therapeutic sense, it's mucilaginous to some extent, and it is very cooling. And it actually took the inflammation out of her thumb or her finger just by having it in there. And we ended up switching through several splints. You know, we put a new piece of celery on every 30 or 40 minutes. And by the time the evening was over, most of this blueness and the swelling was gone. And quite frankly, we didn't expect that. But again, sodium and the minerals in celery are so high that it just helps the body with healing, because what heals everything in the body? Trace minerals and amino acids make every new cell that you get. And so we were giving her body an easy way to access some of that stuff. But that's something else that I would have thrown into that potassium broth. Get some sodium in there too. So the celery and the potatoes would be the two most important things. I've got a lemon in there. Now, lemon's very astringent, and it really helps to understand the properties of the herbs, okay? Coffee is a bitter herb. Coffee and chocolate are the only two bitters in the American diet. That's probably why they're the two great addictions that we have. We don't eat dandelion anymore. We don't eat chicory anymore. We don't eat bitter things. And bitter things are very stimulating to the liver. They cause the bile ducts to open. They cause the body to want to just purge, get things out and gone. Lemon, on the other hand, is very astringent. It tightens things. Squeeze it. I mean, think about what happens when you put it in your mouth. Just pucker up and lock up. Well, the lemon and the coffee both have therapeutic use for the liver. The coffee was used by Dr. Max Gerson at Johns Hopkins University Hospital in treating debilitating illnesses, especially cancer, because as an enema, it flushes the bile ducts and causes the liver to purge and to cleanse. And so people say, oh, well, lemons are good for your liver, and coffee enemas are good for the liver, so do both all the time. But remember, if you've talked at all or been to any of the classes about how herbs are working, if you've got a very inflamed liver, you may not want to do coffee enemas because you're going to cause it to expand further, and it could increase pain and so forth. So you may first want to tighten it down a little bit, and lemon juice and water would be something that would be helpful to do that. If you've got a very, very tightened liver, then you may find that the coffee enema is going to be more helpful with something that's a very toxic, condition where the liver's closed down, shut down, instead of wide open. So anyway, lemons in water, we've talked about them stimulating the digestion. We've talked about them being helpful for the liver. They're also helpful for the kidneys. And because of that astringent property, why do you think they put honey and lemon in so many cough formulas? Okay, when you're coughing and you've got laryngitis or a sore throat, typically what's happened is you have a lot of inflammation in the membranes, the mucous membranes here. And the lemon juice will help to take that down. It will help very much to tighten it up. In fact, when we were, I was teaching a workshop and I was extremely ill and had very little with me, but my throat was really sore, very, very painful. And it was because of all the swelling. And so I literally got some lemons, cut them in half, and dribbled the juice down my throat. It burned terribly, but it did take the inflammation down very, very fast, and the pain stopped shortly thereafter. So lemons are something really good to have around. Remember that the body has a tendency, especially with the soaps that we use today and the diet that we have today, to become very alkaline externally. And that's one of the other things that fungus and parasitic infections really, really like, things like ringworm and athlete's foot and those things. And so one of the best things that you should have in your kitchen is cider vinegar. The white vinegar is made from wood pulp and processed, I've heard, with formaldehyde, I don't know, but there's no nutritive value to it. Cider vinegar or wine vinegar, any kind of a fruit vinegar, on the other hand, has tremendous mineral content. And so it's one of the best foods that you can use to get minerals. And so when you read about these honey and vinegar cures or lemon and vinegar cures, what you're gaining from that when people say that taking vinegar helps their arthritis is one thing, the acidity of the body. For one thing, the acidity level in the body becomes more balanced. Taking in the external the acid from the diet, you're going to find that you digest the proteins better and so forth, and the body will begin to flush out the waste acid more effectively, which is what causes the stiffness in people who have arthritis. But the vinegar, because it's very good at acidifying things, people will find that if they have ringworm and use just vinegar on it, that it will wipe the ringworm out, usually in a matter of a couple of days. People will take a cotton ball and saturate it and put it on. So it's helpful in that kind of stuff. Or splashing their feet with it after a shower. Anytime, rashes, very often rashes sometimes are caused by being hyperacid, but sometimes they're caused by just the body's balance being so far off, and vinegar will help with that. So that's a good thing to have it around for. Vinegar's best use, though, is in getting those minerals back into the body. We talked about that vinegar cure that people have it's always hitting the tabloids. About every 6 months it's on one of the tabloids. But in the old days, way back in the 1800s, people used to make something they called a Yankee haymaker's drink. Up in New England, where people were out in 110 degrees, 12 hours at a time, mowing hay by hand, they would get very tired. Now, that was before the Gatorade days, right? Now, Gatorade is all synthetic stuff anyway, so it's not going to do, it may do a short-term fix, but it's not actually digestible, and in the long term is stressing the liver. Oops, I shouldn't have said Gatorade, right? Those power beverages that people drink. But that was their comparative thing back then for getting the body rehydrated and remineralized. And they would take vinegar and molasses in about equal parts and then mix it with water. And it really is not terrible. We made it for my Pioneer Medicine workshop one time, and it's kind of lemonade-y. If you think about, most of your lemonades don't have lemon in them anyway today. They're made with citric acid. It's just a very acidic substance. And that gives that tartness to the body that really helps. Now, because of that mineral level, it's also really helpful where there's cramping. Some athletes will find if they begin to get leg cramps, if they will splash their legs with the cider vinegar, it will very rapidly help to eliminate those cramps and take those out. Because of that mineral level, I've used it again with the vomiting. We had a situation once with somebody vomiting, and I used it just on rubbing it on the stomach. And it was absorbed to some extent. I've thrown it into baths on many, many occasions, or used it when I'm just really, really tired to splash with vinegar after a shower, get those minerals back in there and kind of gets you back on your feet. My daughter once, she was about 2.5, I guess, and I let her get very sunburned. It did not even occur to me that she would get as burned as she did, and I felt horrible, and she was having a really hard time holding anything down. And I realized she'd not voided in about 7 hours. And so we had a serious dehydration problem, and I was giving myself about 30 minutes before I was going to take her to the emergency room, and I threw her into a tepid bath full of vinegar. I poured about half of a gallon of vinegar into her bath and just let her sit there, and that got the mineral level up. She absorbed it through her skin enough that she stopped with the dry heaves. She was able, within about 20 minutes, to start sipping water and getting that back into her system. And so it was something that was just really a nice thing to have around. It's very inexpensive, it's readily available, and it's something that's really, really helpful to have in your kitchen, just, hanging all around. The last thing I have in there is garlic, and most people are familiar with garlic. It is important from a health standpoint if you're looking at it, the studies that say that it reduces cholesterol and so forth. For that particular benefit, it does need to be raw. And that's why so many people will take it in a capsule or a tablet form rather than trying just to eat the cloves. They're a little much. I do know people who've actually swallowed them down whole, like capsules or something. But most people want it covered up a little bit. When I've had a cold or something coming on, I have taken fresh garlic, crushed it up on a spoon, covered it with honey so that I could get it down and just down the whole thing. But for most people, it's a little more pleasant to take a capsule or something, because although the garlic is going to be an aromatic and it's going to be stimulating, even dried and cooked into your spaghetti sauce or your garlic bread or whatever, you do not get some of the health benefits associated with garlic by taking it in a cooked form. One other caution about garlic is that what makes it really effective is something called allicin. And when you have your allicins altered, now there are odorless garlics on the market, and they'll say, yes, but we fermented it and we kept all the allicins and so forth. In most cases, they're just not as effective. There are some now that are coated, where they'll coat it with chlorophyll so that it's kind of like an enteric coating and it doesn't break apart till it's in the small intestine. And that way you're not going to be tasting the garlic. But garlic is a systemic substance. And so if you take enough garlic, you will smell garlic coming out through your feet. You will smell garlic in your perspiration. You will smell like garlic. And it's because it does go into the bloodstream so very quickly and permeate the body that it's able to come out in the perspiration and so forth. So that's just, one of the things you have to do. You can just eat lots of parsley at the same time. Parsley is one of the best foods for the kidneys. It's high in potassium, and it's something that you can have lots and lots of, but it's also something that you don't want to have lots and lots and lots of if you're trying to nurse a baby, because in large amounts it can cause the mother's milk to be diminished. And that's great if you're trying to accomplish that in a natural way, but most of us are not. So that's the only caution that you want to use with parsley in that sense. I think that about covers most of what I had ready to share. I've got about 3 minutes left. If we've got questions, we can try to include them. And then you guys can go home and start shopping much more carefully.
You keep talking about the iced drinks, iced water and such. And we live out in West Cocoa, so we use bottled water. Cool water is fine as long as we're not adding the water. I mean, it doesn't take long to get to room temperature.
I try not to use water to drink anything that's not at room temperature or my body temperature. You know, now my rooms hopefully are not as hot as my body most of the time, but it's much closer. Anything that's coming out of even a refrigerator is still very cold. And if you've ever been an athlete, you know that your coach usually will not let you near a water fountain when you're hot and thirsty, because they don't want you taking that in because of the tendency that it has to cause cramping. They may let you pour the ice water over your head, but they will not let you drink it because they don't want that body to start spasming. Most people who crave ice are extremely deficient in minerals. Minerals are what cause the muscles to have their tone. And if you've got no tone and you come up with something very cold, boom, everything gets tight again. And you get your tone right back. So that's one of those food cravings too. When you want something really, you know, like kids that just chop on ice all the time, usually they need a lot of minerals added to the diet. Yes?
I've been hearing a lot about herbal teas. Well, the new thing with the teas was to drink green tea or black tea, but not to drink herbal teas. And I always thought herbal teas were the best.
I don't personally consume anything with caffeine in it, green tea or black tea. There are some studies that indicate that green tea has some health benefits in that it does have antioxidant properties. But I don't think that there are so many other things, excellent antioxidants out there, that I don't feel like the caffeine benefit or that the caffeine is justified by the amount of antioxidant properties that the green tea has. I do use a green tea deodorant because topically as an antioxidant it works fine and it's an effective deodorant. But I don't consume any of the green tea or the black tea. I also don't consume black pepper. Black pepper is cured with arsenic. And so I use the red pepper. Now, granted, you're not going to be consuming huge amounts of black pepper at any given point, but some people are extremely sensitive to arsenic. People who are allergic to almonds, for example, frequently arsenic is fairly high in almonds, and so some people just can't tolerate almonds, and those are people that probably should also stay away from black pepper. But the herbal teas have been around for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. There is a story, I'll end with this, from China that explains the origin of tea, black tea. It said that one day the Buddha was sitting and meditating and he fell asleep. And when he woke, he was so angry with himself for having fallen asleep that he cut off his eyelids and threw them to the ground. And from his eyelids sprang the tea plant. And that's where we have our black tea coming from, because it does have those stimulating effects. Black tea, the most harmful reason, the reason I don't drink it is not because of the caffeine, but because of the tannins. You can actually tan things with tea, and they tend to tan the bladder and tan the ureters. And I prefer to have my body fairly mobile and alive rather than trying to preserve it. I don't preserve it with artificial preservatives. I don't preserve it with tannins. And I try as much as possible, because I like having this, to feed it. I have fun with it. I enjoy it. And that means that if I just absolutely have to have a piece of caramel turtle cheesecake, I will do it. And as Dr. Bernard Jensen said, if you're going to cheat on your diet, it's important to enjoy it so that you don't add the guilt and the stress to all the other things that you're doing in your life. Eating should not be a consuming part of your life. And it should not be one of the hard things that you have to do. It's a gift and a blessing, but we need to use it with wisdom and with thanksgiving and with our blessings before the meals, and make it a part of life that we celebrate. And we do that most by honoring the things we were given to eat and taking care of each other with the things we were given and provided for to do that with. Thanks for coming. Yeah. And frankly, I have a little bit of a problem with cranberry capsules. I think that they're really good. My concern is that when people take cranberry capsules, they're not as conscious of drinking everything. I'd rather see people drinking the cranberry juice concentrate just because I know they're going to get a lot of fluid. And if I'm fighting like a bladder infection, I got a kidney infection coming home from Pennsylvania one time, driving home from Pennsylvania. This is unbelievable here. I drank almost 2 gallons of water in the course of that 20 hours driving because, I was in a lot of pain. And by the time I got home from that trip, the kidney infection was gone. I hadn't had time to go to the doctor. This was way back in the early days when I first was learning about herbs. But just by doing the cranberry juice, the pure cranberry juice, and huge amounts of water, the problem resolved itself. The bacteria didn't have a place to grow anymore, I think, because I was just moving it through so fast. So that's the concern. People will pop 2 cranberry capsules with their Diet Coke. And then they're going to say, well, herbs just don't work.